Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization. Do you need mobility work if your goal is simply to gain muscle? That's the main organizing principle of your training. Let's find out. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to define mobility because a ton of people say mobility have no effing idea what they're talking about. Take that, YouTube algorithm tries to ban us by swearing too much. Number two, we're going to talk about mobility limitations that actually occur in hypertrophy training. Third, we're going to talk about when to actually work on mobility during hypertrophy training because there's times you should and times probably is not necessary. Then we're going to talk about how to actually improve mobility if you need to in hypertrophy training, the best methods. And then we're going to talk about quite numerous number of fads and follies in the mobility space, not just hypertrophy, but all over in all of sports. So here we go. Defining mobility. So there's a couple terms that get thrown around. Let's just clear the air. Flexibility is the ability to assume a wide range of anatomical positions. Like if I do this with your, splits, like these are feet, by the way. I can't do the splits. But if you can bend your hips all crazy, you have a high degree of flexibility. Okay. Strength is the ability to produce a high degree of force. Okay. Different concept. Why the hell are we talking about strength? Mobility is the intersection of strength and flexibility. It is the ability to produce high forces across a wide range of anatomical positions. So if you can do the splits on a slippery floor and then stand up through the splits, you have godlike mobility. Okay, that's an example. You're able to produce a ton of strength through a high degree of flexibility. Because if you take really little kids or folks that aren't super strong but are really skinny, a lot of times their flexibility is impressive. They can go all the way down on a dip, and then you're come up, and they're nope. That doesn't mean they're mobile. Okay, they're actually immobile in that position, but they are very flexible. And you could be really strong, but super bound up. And they're all right, touch the bar to your chest in the bench. And you're I can't, right? And then we can't say that you have a high degree of mobility. So mobility is both the ability to move through large range of motion and to provide high forces at all of those ranges, right? Sport-specific mobility is very important because it's so different between each sport. Sport-specific mobility is the ability to produce the requisite forces, the ones needed for high performance, either in training or competition, through the range of anatomical degrees typically presented in sport training competitions. For example, if you can do the splits, does that help you in bodybuilding outside of doing the splits in your posing routine or something? No, right? What about in basketball? Also no. What about in gymnastics? Required, right? So different sports are going to have different degrees of mobility, and thus you're going to train them a bit differently because if you can press a log overhead, but you can't even get a third of the way to the splits, you get to win World's Strongest Man potentially. If you can't press a log overhead because you're not that strong, but you can do crazy splits and come out of them, you might win worlds in gymnastics, right? So sport-specific mobility is making sure you are mobile enough, strong and flexible to do the movements of your sport that are present in training and competition. And for hypertrophy, we're talking about specifically training. Can you do what it takes? Do you have the mobility? Now, so the exact definition of hypertrophy training specific mobility is the ability to produce requisite forces for stimulative hypertrophy training in the range of anatomical positions required for hypertrophy training. Okay, so if you can pretzel your arm behind your back, sweet, but I've never seen that exercise in the gym to get you jacked. So no bonus points there, right? But if you can't do a pull-up or a pull-down because you're so immobile, maybe that's a limiting factor, right? So there's fundamentally sort of two ways this can occur in hypertrophy training, this lack of mobility. Okay, so now we're talking about a lack of mobility in hypertrophy training. There's two ways that it can happen. The first is an inability to assume or maintain actual training positions. So you can't even get into the positions. Here are some examples. This is not an inclusive list. Can't put the bar on your back to back squat. Okay, your muscles are so big, you're so bound up, have such shitty flexibility or whatever, that you can't even put a bar on your back. That happens, okay? It happens to me. So I have to actually grab the bar on the outsides. Some of you have maybe seen my training videos. That has to be the case. Can't touch the bar to your clavicles in the overhead press. Some people in the overhead press, they stop here and they're that's it. They pull down, I can't. There's stuff physically in the way. Okay, or they're just not flexible enough for other reasons. Definitely an example there. When you're trying to do your stiff-legged deadlifts or good mornings, your back rounds. Just as soon as you try to hinge at the hips, your back starts to round. There's a bunch of different factors that can be responsible, but that is an inability to maintain or assume your training position, right? And you can't keep your heels down in a deep squat. Every time you try to squat deep, your heels come up, okay? That's definitely a problem because you're not in the right training position. It's not optimally force generating or safe, and then you can't train as well as you could. Now, part B, the second way you can have immobility or lack of mobility in hypertrophy training is that you can get into pretty extended positions, large angles in your motion, but you are unable to generate overloading forces in them. You can generate some force, but there's a huge drop off that we just normally wouldn't expect for that movement. For example, if you can do a ton of weight in the pull-up like this, but if we have you hang all the way down and you're like, I can't even do my body weight, yeah, that's probably a mobility concern. Same idea with dips. Some people can dip a lot, but when they go all the way down in the dips, not like all the way down hurt your shoulders all the way down, but all the way down and still feel comfortable, and they're like, I got nothing here, right? That may be a mobility problem because you're not able to generate high forces through the full range of motion, which is how you grow the most muscle. There's just ranges of motion that are normal for that exercise, and anytime you get into them, there's a huge fall off. It's definitely something we'll address, right? Another example there is your weight in the hack squat, or leg press drastically falls when you do full range of motion. Like you're squatting 600 to halfway down and we have you do full squat and you're squatting like 185 for a set of 5. And you're like, okay. We usually don't think that someone who partial squat 600 should be squatting only 185 for a set of 5 all the way down. Something is up and potentially we can fix it. So now, let's find out when a problem is sort of severe enough or is worthy of attention. So when to work on mobility in hypertrophy training. So first, let's rule out the problems that don't require mobility work, okay? Specific mobility work. Here we go. First situation, which does not require mobility work. Your muscle is just too big to get the ROM that you're used to getting, okay? Like on skull crushers, if your arms and shoulders get big enough, you actually can't move your elbows in anymore because your pecs are literally in the way, and you can't get as deep because your biceps are touching your forearm, and there is no fixing that. Okay, so don't worry about it. It just happens. It's a cool problem to have because it means you're jacked, but it's just part of the problem. If you guys want, go on Instagram and follow Nicholas Vulliad, no affiliation. He's just a pro bodybuilder. He's like 5'3" and like 240 in his off-season lean. And you look at his training videos and you're like, wow, that really is full range of motion for him because he's so enormous for his frame that he can barely move in tons of these exercises that we're used to seeing a high range of motion. Because no amount of mobility work that's ever going to help him with that specific problem because there's just shit in the way and that's it. Because can't do anything about it, right? Another concern. So concern number 2 that you don't address with mobility work, you're fat. Okay, like I used to have a problem where my gut was so big I couldn't get deep leg presses. The problem wasn't that I couldn't get deep leg presses. The problem was my gut was too big, so I lost some fat and then I got better. All right, so if you're pretty over fat and you know it, and you're like, I need mobility work, like, do you though? Do you though? Maybe you just need to lose some fat, which is always a good idea for a bunch of other reasons. Okay, so give that some thought. So let me come back real quick. Sometimes when you're on a mass gaining phase and you get a little bit fat, your mobility declines. Just know that. Like you're not squatting as deep as you used to because your gut and your leg fat is sort of in the way and that's touching each other, and that's okay. It's not something like, what I don't want you guys to do is be like, shit, like my mobility is messed up. Like I've been gaining weight and everything's great. My strength is great, but like my mobility sucks. What should I do about it? Like nothing. Like you're just going to get the mobility back when you get leaner again. It's just part of the process, right? Number 3, reason not to go do mobility work for hypertrophy training is you're not using a proper technique. Okay, a lot of mobility problems are just doing the exercise wrong. Super common. People say like, oh, I can't get deep on the squat. Like 2 or 3 minutes of work with them in real life, like take your feet, put them out more, point your toes out, sit back and then sit down. Okay, great, you're doing full squats. And I go, holy shit, I thought my ankles weren't flexible enough. Like, no, you're just putting your feet in the wrong position and you weren't opening up your hips properly. Okay, so before you conclude mobility work is the problem, technique, I would say in 80% of all cases, actually fixes the issues completely. So it's almost always a technique problem. Lastly, this one's a tough sell, but I feel like most of you will be with me on this. You're just fucking weak. It's not a mobility problem. It's just not that strong problem, right? You say, okay, I used to be able to leg press 500, but when I go all the way down to leg press, I can only leg press 315. Like you could have just started that statement late and said, I can only leg press 315, because that's the only thing you can leg press in reality when it's done through full range of motion. You never could leg press 500. You were partial leg pressing it, which is a huge insult to you. You should cry about it. All right. So actually go deep, shut up, and take weight off the bar and do what it takes. And then when you actually come back up to going super deep and leg pressing 500, you're going to look down at your legs and be like, holy shit, I have big quads. Fucking miracle. Right? So a lot of times people are like, oh man, I don't have a lot of mobility. I've had folks in real life say this to me, training with me on occasion. I'll be like, oh man, I can't get deep in the squat. And then they got like 405 on the squat. I'm like, interesting. So we go back down to the bar, and it turns out they can get deep. And we go up to 225, and they're getting crushed for sets of 8 with 225, super deep. And they're like, oh shit, I never had 225 mess me up like this. I'm like, And at that point, you don't rub it in their face, but they know, right? And then hopefully they just keep going 225, 230, 235, et cetera, staying deep, getting great workouts, much less joint stress. And it turns out mobility was never the problem. Using too much weight was the problem. However, that all is easy solved problems because you don't need to do mobility work. However, there are some problems where you can benefit from mobility work, right? One is you get very limited range of motion out of very effective movements, and you want to use those movements like shoulder presses, stiff-legged deadlifts, squats. Like you tried all the stuff and it turns out like you really just can't get the range of motion out of squats, but you're like, I need bigger legs, damn it. And again, the machines are good, but like, I'm not going to throw away the king of all exercises, the squat, right? For like, just because I never tried to work on my mobility. Maybe if I fix my mobility somehow, we'll get to how in a bit, maybe I can squat. That would be great, right? Stiff-legged deadlifts, huge hamstring builder. I would surmise that there's not a number of leg curls in the world you can do to optimize your hamstring size unless you do also some kind of hip hinge, like heavy good mornings, heavy stiff-legged deadlifts, et cetera. And if you can't do good mornings and stiff-legged deadlifts because of lower back mobility issues, it's worth exploring the mobility front because you could be missing out on a great exercise. Right? And I'll have a story for you guys later. I've actually done that before to myself with a great degree of success. And another reason, which may require mobility work, is you seem to have trouble coordinating movement at a very deep position in the movement, a very extended position, and it drops your stability and force production a lot. Like you can do dips pretty far down and do like some hanging weight and a lot of reps. But when you do dips to all the way down, no pain in your shoulders or anything. You're just like, your strength is way down. And that's usually something you may be able to fix, and thus you can maximize your range of motion, maximize how much tension is produced at the stretch position, which again is a huge hypertrophic stimulus. All these great things happen, and all you had to do was sort of focus on the mobility work and not just be like, I'm just going to accept this. All right. So what are the best mobility approaches to hypertrophy training? Okay, now that let's say we have identified that mobility really is a limiting factor on something, and we want to change it. There are 3 good approaches at least, right, that can increase our mobility. And it's going to take a little while, and some of these are not magic, and you're going to look at them and be like, God damn it, why did I watch a video about this obvious shit? Sometimes shit is obvious, all right? Number 1, incrementally doing slightly more range of motion with great technique over the weeks and weeks and weeks of training. So for example, last month you did stiff-legged deadlifts to a 6-inch block. Okay, 6 inches above the ground is where you stop the lift. With good technique, your back is nice and flat, your knees are back, et cetera. You feel it's a hip hinge, you feel it in your hams. This month, you go to a 5-inch block. And at first it feels kind of weird and like your technique is almost perfect, but a little bit rounded. And then at the end of the month, the 5-inch block feels amazing and you feel super flexible and it feels like really strong. And then maybe 2 months later, you go to a 4-inch block and so on and so on. All right. Eventually, you'll end up much more flexible than you ever were. And because you're training strength through that range, you'll be strong at all those ranges too, right? I did this with good mornings, stiff-legged deadlifts, and bent over rows because I wanted to have a tight back for bent over rows. When I started doing stiff-legged deadlifts, good mornings I did later, stiff-legged deadlifts and bent over rows, the lowest I could get before my lower back started to round was the bar hanging at my knees and no lower. Like it's insulting because I was almost completely upright. I was like, well, that's it. And I didn't try to just go to the ground and round my back. Slowly over time, I tried to go a little deeper, set up some blocks a little deeper. And after a while, I was with a completely tight back doing stiff-legged deadlifts and rows to, if we had 45s on the bar, what would be below the floor. So I had to stand at a deficit or put 25s on the bar, something like that. Mission accomplished. And I grew a ton of muscle on that way. And over the time, because I didn't have to use much more weight, because the range of motion increased the actual forces to the muscle, then I was able to make sure that I didn't get hurt. Really, really good. It works. I promise. I've done it before. Does it take patience? Of course it does. But it's also a pretty permanent fix. Like once you're down there and you're practicing those movements, never a problem again. And best part, you get to do it while you're training, so it's no extra work. You're just still growing muscle. It's just the way you're going about it also improves your mobility. And last bonus point, because your mobility was kind of a limiting factor for how much you got out of the exercises, if you're slowly, incrementally improving your mobility, you're actually getting more and more and more of the exercises all the time. Eventually, when you're stiff-legged deadlifting, like you start stiff-legged deadlifting, and with a tight back, you can only go to your knees, like the movement stimulus to fatigue ratio is like fine. It's fine. When you're stiff-legged deadlifting all the way to the ground with 45-pound plates or even lower, oh my God, like 2 or 3 sets of that lights your hamstrings up like crazy, right? So it turns into a better and better movement the longer you do it. Number 2, strategy. Pause at the bottom position of a lift where you have a mobility problem and milk the shit out of it. So what you do is stay super tight in the core and all of the joints that aren't supposed to be moving. Okay, so if you're pausing at the bottom of a squat, your shoulders are retracted, your core is super tight, you're not like, you don't pause and just die at the bottom and wilt like a flower. Everything stays nice and upright, nice and rigid, okay? And then you let the moving joints, like the knees and the hips in the squat, for example, sink a little bit deeper over 2 to 4 seconds. So it's not pause, it's pause and milk. So you go all the way down in the squat to where you can, your heels are still on the ground. You sit there and you kind of just, stay super tight everywhere, except for the knees and the hips, which you sort of let it sink. And remember, that's like 200 pounds on your body or whatever. You're gonna sink, okay? Let it sink you, like slowly just relax your quads and glutes a little bit. Let the sink happen about 2 or 4 seconds and then come up, okay? This works great in a bunch of lifts. Some of the notable examples, dumbbell presses. You go down and back up and then down, sink, 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 and back up, something like that. Leg presses, it works great. Squats, dips, so on and so forth. Tons of movements, right? Do you want to do this first as a first exercise? Maybe not, because you want first exercise of the muscle group to be super hardcore, super high force, focused on performance. Maybe do that for your first exercise, and for your second exercise, pick a movement you want to work on your mobility for, but that also taxes the muscle. And then do this method for the second movement. And then over time, your mobility is going to expand, you're going to grow more muscle, and then everything is going to be great, so great that you can use that second movement you used to have mobility problems with as a first movement. So for example, maybe start your workout with a flat bench press. Okay, no mobility issues because you can touch the bar, you can come all the way up, no problem. The second exercise maybe is an incline dumbbell press and you have some mobility problems, then use the 2 to 4 second sink method. And then after 2 or 3 months, you can dumbbell press through a really crazy, through full range of motion. And maybe that's your first exercise now, or it's just a normal exercise that doesn't have the problem anymore, right? Good news, this also makes you grow over time. So there's no extra work to be done and you get benefits the whole time. Also, you can get really good stimulus just doing that alone. Okay, 2 to 4 seconds sunk at the bottom is just independently stretch under load. It's awesome. Okay, you could just do this normally through training. Number 3, last way to improve mobility is practicing a few, not your whole body for no good goddamn reason, a few targeted to a specific muscle or movement, mobility drills 3 to 6 times per week. Okay, you can do these around training. It's probably better if you do them at home by yourself in a time that's not really close to before training or after to not interfere with the recovery adaptive process. Stretching a muscle a lot before training reduces its force output. Stretching it a lot after probably interferes with some hypertrophy mechanisms to a small degree. So if you're doing mobility work in the morning when you wake up, maybe you train later in the afternoon, that's totally super cool. You have to do them often, okay? You can't do mobility work once or twice a week and say you're getting shit out of it. Like unless you're doing it under heavy load like we are in the first 2 examples, if you're doing just regular at-home mobility work, yoga type stuff, you got to do it real often. At least 3 times a week, probably more like 4, 5, or 6. 5 to 20 minutes at a time is all you need, and any more than that is either overkill or just a negatively really bad idea, and it pisses away a lot of your time. I'm not going to talk about any of these drills because, completely honest with you guys, I don't even fucking know hardly any of them. But there are people that do. Clinical Athlete, clinicalathlete.com, Clinical Athlete on Instagram, Clinical Athlete on YouTube. That's where you go. Dr. Quinn Haddock is in charge of that whole thing, I believe. Super sharp group of folks, and they know their mobility like back and front of their hands, all right? Get on the Clinical Athlete. Find out how to do specific mobility drills. They also have like a pay site situation where it's like their network where you sign up and you get all kinds of exclusive content. Then you can ask questions to all the experts. That's a really great idea. Then if you're really concerned with your mobility and you want targeted mobility drills, that's where you find out how it works. They have a bunch of manuals, all this really, really good stuff. So don't just do random mobility drills. Like, here's who not to follow for mobility drills. Like random girl on Instagram who has an ass and it's like mobility work and it's just her shoving her ass in the camera. Like, you're not gonna learn shit doing that. Go to the experts, find out, and some of them are quite good looking, I might say. Hey, Quinn, get into that and practice it diligently. Weeks and weeks and weeks, 3 to 6 times a week, 5 to 20 minutes each time, the same drills. Then you're going to get better and better and better, and your training's going to improve. Mobility is not a potpourri type of thing where you like sometimes just do it and you're like, like, hey, did you do mobility work this week? Like, I skipped it. How many times do people like post their workouts on Instagram, like, skip mobility work today? Like, sweet, you're going to be so fucking mobile. Never, right? If it's a problem, then do it right. Okay. If you want a solution, do it right. If it's not a problem and it's not in need of a solution, don't do it at all. I don't do mobility work because points 1 and 2 handled everything I ever needed, right? But if I was going to do number 3, I'd probably do it pretty diligently. Lastly, let's talk about a common group of mobility fads and follies and fallacies, dumb shit that people say they do for mobility. It doesn't do a whole lot of anything, and sometimes it hurts. Number 1, doing mobility work for non-problem areas. Like, I've seen people do like mobility work for their hips. I'm like, oh, do you have like trouble with hip mobility and lifts? Like, no. Like, why are you doing this work? Like, prehab. There's no such thing as prehab. There's no such thing as prehab, okay? It's called warming up. Prehab is, I think, a term invented by people who just want to make more money selling you bullshit you don't need, right? Real talk. Number 2, foam rollers, the motorized dildo thing, that's what it is, okay? That whole thing. These are pain modulation devices that can help enhance mobility in the short term because they reduce the perception of pain. They're not long-term mobility enhancers. Either you can use them forever, which takes a shitload of time, or you can actually fix the mobility issue much of the time with something like we talked about in the actual mobility fixes. I'd much rather see you do that. If you need to do these things to get into some positions, that's okay, but I would seek medical assessment first to make sure there's nothing funky going on, and or seek some ways to improve your mobility long-term so that you don't need to rely on these devices. Nothing particularly wrong with them. It's just 9 times out of 10, you could have fixed the problem instead of just, dildo gunning yourself every time before you do bench. Number 3, if you're taking more than 20 minutes to do mobilization, something's seriously wrong with you, you need to go see a medical professional, okay? And maybe you're the exception, but you're probably not. Okay, you're probably just doing way too much of that stuff. It's just the returns for you are not yielding anything. I've seen people warm up and do mobility work for 40 minutes before a 30-minute workout. Holy shit. Like, something's up, okay? Something is definitely up, and your time efficiency is awful. Maybe consider seeing a medical professional, a physical therapist, someone at the Clinical Athlete website to ask some pertinent questions about, because what you're doing is not normal, okay? Lastly, number 4, and this is super, super common. Huge fallacy and fad is to do everything but the hard shit. And what is the hard shit? Humbling yourself with lighter loads for higher ranges of motion and in painful stretch positions. You say like, hey, here's this fun mobility drill. It's super great. Or you can do stiff-legged deadlifts and hold for 2 to 4 seconds at the bottom while your hamstrings tear. Most people are like, yeah, I'm just going to go do the fun stuff, except the fun stuff doesn't work most of the time. And the stiff-legged deadlift thing works almost all the time. Doing consistent low-volume mobility work in your non-gym time. People want to do some kind of weird mobility drill, a new one every day, or like, a random one once every week, and they don't want to just put in the work of figuring out the mobility drills, probably talking to a professional, that they need to be doing those sequentially often, and progressing through them, and then actually accomplishing their task of enhancing their mobility, because that's hard, right? Takes dedication, takes planning, takes scheduling. And lastly, most people don't want to keep track of range of motion progressions to keep pushing the pace, right? How do you know if your stiff-legged deadlift is improving in mobility if you've never measured it? If you never stiff-legged deadlift 2 pins or 2 blocks to see how you're doing? Like, hey, is your mobility improving? Like, I don't know, I kind of feel better. Right? It's tough. It's annoying to keep track of stuff, but it's going to pay off in the long term because if you do this stuff right, you can actually fix most of your mobility problems. And we said this before, you probably don't have mobility problems nearly as much as you thought, but the ones you do have, you can fix forever just doing proper training and a couple of targeted mobility drills. Don't fall for the hype. Folks, that's all I have to say on the matter before I upset myself too much. Catch you next time for the next video.